So I'm Heidi. I am the missioner for racial reconciliation for the Episcopal Church. So I'm a church-wide staff member, this is what I do. This is my ministry, and I think particularly in the aftermath of Michael Brown's killing and Eric Garner's killing and Tamir Rice's killing, we've seen a resurgence in folks wanting to find ways to engage in conversations about racism and racial justice. I think particularly in a lot of Episcopal parishes, there's a strong desire to do that. There's oftentimes a really strong commitment to social justice ministries. But when it comes to talking about race and racism, it's a really different kind of conversation for a lot of folks to have. Historically, we have been a church of slave-owning bishops, right? I was just at Sewanee, and they have this, incredible sort of history of being founded by a bishop who was one of the largest, his family was some of the largest slaveholders in the state of Tennessee. But at the same time, Sewanee is the place where faculty walked out when the university had failed to admit a black student. Bishop Polk, Leonidas Polk, at the same time that he owned slaves and had these plantations, I learned when I was in Louisiana that he built lots of chapels on his lands, and he baptized all of the babies that were born into slavery. So that's kind of the story of the Episcopal Church right there. We have a legacy of people making their fortune in the slave trade, for those of you who have seen Traces of the Trade. But we also have a legacy of civil rights martyr like Jonathan Daniels. And we also have a legacy of lots of folks being involved in social justice issues. But there are other pieces of our culture as well. For example, we tend to be an intellectual church. And sometimes, we can think about things, up here, and it really takes a long time for it to kind of move down here. So I really liked what Dr. Brown shared with us this morning. And when it comes to formation and teaching, who you are matters significantly more than the curriculum or content that you teach or what you know. Now that can be interpreted in a couple of different ways, right? That can be interpreted as, and is often interpreted as, I'm a white person, I have no direct experience of racism, I can't talk about it. And then that kind of turns into let's find the nearest person of color and ask them to teach about racism, right? But I would invite you to think about it in terms of this. I am a person engaged in the ministry of spiritual formation. And that means that there's a lot of things that I have to address and talk about that I do not have direct experience with. But it is my commitment to my ministry that is going to allow me to create spaces where we can talk about these important elements of spiritual formation. So, thinking about shame and guilt, for example, we're going to talk a little bit about that again today too. The feeling for white Americans that you can't talk about racism because there's no authentic experience can get us in trouble in a lot of ways. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I think that as Episcopalians, as people who are called to ministry, we have to do better. And I really loved, this morning was just a great intro for the whole workshop. I was kind of like, well, they kind of did everything I was going to do. I can just sit in my room and have a cup of coffee. But I really do believe that ministries of racial reconciliation start in our baptismal covenant. Now, we can say this together. Would you like to say it together?
Yeah.
Can I have some person with a collar volunteer to lead us?
Do you believe in God the Father?
I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth.
Do you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God?
I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead.
Do you believe in God the Holy Spirit?
I believe in the Holy Spirit, of the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting.
Will you continue in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers?
I will with God's help.
Will you persevere in resisting evil, and whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord?
I will with God's help.
Will you proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Christ?
I will with God's help.
Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself?
I will with God's help.
Will you strive for justice and peace among all people, and respect the dignity of every human being?
I will with God's help.
Thank you. So for me, as a missionary for racial reconciliation, kind of people ask me, so what is that exactly? What do you do? And my 10-second elevator speech is, what I really want to do is empower people to fully live into our baptismal covenant, right? And for me, that also involves some accountability, right? How do we hold one another accountable to that sort of theological framework of I will with God's help? Because I think that says a lot about our identity as Episcopalians, and I think Vicki did a really great job of explaining all of that this morning, that it's not passive, right? We're going to do it, right? We're not thinking about it, there's no if, as she said, and that we're not alone. So for me, racial reconciliation is really about spiritual formation, that it is an active commitment to my own faith, that is why I engage in racial reconciliation. I think we cannot fully embrace and love the body of Christ, including all of us, unless we engage in racial reconciliation. And that is my ministry. And it comes out of my personal experience as an immigrant to this country, growing up in a predominantly white town in Muscatine, Iowa. My brothers and I used to joke that when we went to college, the Asian population in our town went down by 60%. So, that was my background. So again, I think that this is something that will come up again in talking about identity versus behavior. The baptismal covenant is more than just our identity as Episcopalians, although it informs our identity as Episcopalians. It is also calling us to behave as Episcopalians by embracing I will with God's help. Now, when it comes to talking about race and racism, particularly for a lot of Christians, all of our ideas about God and love and forgiveness and reconciliation just go out the window. How many of you have ever participated in like a diversity training, racial justice kind of training that was really powerful and meaningful and really changed how you saw the world? Okay. How many of you have participated in one of those trainings where you were just thinking, oh my gosh, if I had a pencil, I would stick it in my eye, how soon will we be out of here? Okay, so honestly, right, a lot of us have done both, right? And how many of you in your diocese have some sort of anti-racism training that really is just a protest, let's just check off the box and then I don't have to do it for 5 years, okay? Or 3 years or whatever it may be, okay. So it's really difficult for us to talk about race and racism. And again, for Episcopalians, that's part of our complexity of our identity and our history, right? With both being a church where powerful people benefited from the slave trade or from owning enslaved peoples, where there's a history of segregation and exclusion in some of our churches and some of our parishes. So I've shared with you this piece of artwork by Deborah Nelson Link, who I met when I visited Ferguson, Missouri last month. She is African American. She is a parishioner at Christ Church Cathedral in St. Louis. She was a kindergarten teacher, and she does a lot of work with Christ Church Cathedral in terms of their Black History Month celebrations, their Martin Luther King celebration. And I really loved this piece of work because it's provocative, right? There's a lot of words and images there that are sometimes difficult for us to talk about. And Dr. Brown talked about that this morning, our difficulty of really engaging with this concept of unearned privilege. And that's actually, I think, the word that stands out the most in this piece. It's usually the first one that people see. But what I really like about this piece is that there are a lot of different levels in which you can engage with it. And, you know, you kind of see something new every time you look at it. So part of it for us, I think, when we talk about race and racism is it often feels like it's enough to proclaim the identity. And then the rest of the world just needs to fall in line with that identity. So I think shame lies in the realm of identity, right? I am a bad person. When we start talking about racism, I think people will sort of proclaim the identity, I am not a racist. But I think for a lot of white Americans, there's both a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. And I think that the way that we talk about race and racism creates a lot of shame and humiliation for everyone. So how do we kind of move beyond that? Again, so I think if we think about, you know, shame is kind of in that realm of identity. Guilt is in that realm of behavior, right? I did something bad. I think that moving out of shame, when she talked about how do you sort of break that cycle of shaming language, she actually talked about knowing yourself really, really well, right? Identifying your own behaviors and your own reactions. And that's really, really important, right? Because people are sort of, you know, a lot of folks that I know, it's really, they're saying things like, we need to have a conversation about race and racism, I don't know how to do it. And really the work that they need to do is internal work, right? It's their own sort of anxieties and their own fears about delving into that and to being discovered. Right? As teachers, right, we all have that. One of these days they're going to discover that I don't know absolutely anything about the subject matter that I'm teaching. So I was a teacher. I worked in both secondary education and higher education. And there were days when I showed up and I'm supposed to give a lecture on something and I read that book 3 months ago. But you know, my kid was up all night coughing, and you just show up, right, and you fake it. But when it comes to talking about racism, that fear, and I think that shame that we have, or conversely, the anger and rage and grief that we have, gets in the way of our being able to actually love one another, right? So the advantage that we have of being a church and talking about these things is that, you know, we're supposed to be able to forgive one another. So today we're going to figure out how do we do that well, and I'm going to actually learn from you. That's what we're going to get to. So identity and behavior, right? For those of you who are teachers, you've all heard this, right? I'm an introvert. Right? That's a really hard one. When I was teaching, the kids would come in and I'd see the red ink all over the paper and they'd say, then I'm an A student. And I'd say, how nice for you. You wrote a C paper. And part of what she was talking about, right, with parents and the HR departments and all that kind of thing, there's sort of this identity, right, that I am this thing and nothing can change it. I have no plan B. Really great one. Now, I come from the unchurched Northwest, right? And in the unchurched Northwest, you can say something like, I'm an Episcopalian, and they think that's like, oh, so that means you don't eat any gluten? We're not a very church place, so it's a little bit unusual. And we have behaviors, right? So again, in the unchurched Northwest, I have a lot of atheist and agnostic friends who are really, really very eager to point out the hypocrisies of Christians who claim to be one way and live their lives in a very different way. So the whole, you know, Mark Driscoll Mars Hill scandal was very front and center, and again, that was, you know, he was based in the Seattle area. So sort of just another reason to be very critical of Christianity. So this is a big one. So I'm sure you've all heard somebody say, I'm not a racist, but. Now, that's the sort of interpersonal piece, right? And we've all experienced that. Somebody saying, well, I'm not a racist, but, you know, Michael Brown was just a thug, and those cops must have just been terrified for their lives, or some other piece of information that comes out. Here's a really interesting thing that's happening throughout the Episcopal Church. This is something that actually happened in the Diocese of Los Angeles. Right?
All right.
So if you think about it in terms of the 5 marks of mission, right? Sharing the good news, engaging in evangelism, right? We're an inclusive parish. We share our space. We have a Chinese language service. So this was something that actually happened, right? And Bishop went to the rector of that parish and said, no, would you have taken $500 a month with no benefits? And he said, no, but that priest did it. And we can think of all the reasons why that priest would say, yes, I want to minister. So one of the things that happen, right, is in these immigrant communities, parishioners start giving cash to the pastor under the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the English language congregation is really pissed off because they aren't donating to the annual fund, right, the annual pledge. Right? So, again, so our identity is we're an inclusive parish, right? We've done all these things. We have gone out of our way to be welcoming. But the behavior actually speaks to something quite different. So, since no one is a racist anymore, one of the things that I love that Dr. Brown said is, knowledge is only rumor until it lives in the bones. That's a big one for when we think about racism and how we want to deal with racism. Like, we know enough to not burn crosses in somebody's front yard. But do we know enough to engage one another seriously? So the Bishop of Pittsburgh just recently published a pastoral letter about racism. Did any of you get to read that? Well, it's actually quite lovely. And then one of the things that he said, the last thing that he said is that the most difficult thing that he said for us to do as Christians is to reach out and talk to somebody from a different race or from a different background. And on the one hand, I'm saying this is really great that a bishop is encouraging people to reach across racial and cultural lines. On the other hand, as somebody who engages in this work, as you know, this is what I do, it made me nervous, right? Because a lot of times, and I saw this, I'll give you an example, a parallel example. When I worked at a college, and it was a residential college, and people, the students who were from very, very affluent backgrounds in this poor working class town in rural Maine would talk to the people who worked in the food services. And they'd say, oh, I just love Mary. I just adore her. She's so lovely. And it was kind of their way of being cool because they were down with a working class person. But they actually treated Mary like she was a pet, right? She was this person who symbolized something about their identity. And so even though Mary was generous and loving and wonderful with these young people, and many of them were generous and loving back, as Mark was saying, you know, they didn't know her story, right? They said that they loved her, but they didn't know what brought her pain. And some of what brought her pain was the fact that if there were 6-foot snowdrifts, you know, and she lived 20 miles away on a rural road that hadn't been plowed, she still had to be at work at 6 a.m. Right? They didn't know that. You know, they were just upset when she wasn't there, right? So when we say go out and meet a person of another race, it's not their job to educate you, right? And this is part of the, you know, well, I'm not a racist, but I'm going to then behave in this way that, you know, you are there for my purposes. So this is the sort of second dichotomy that I want to think about. Intent and impact, right? So how do we know that what we're saying is what's being heard? That was also brought up this morning. When we talk about that in education circles, and maybe you do this in formation as well, I'm not sure, my background in education, we talk about planned curriculum, and then taught curriculum, and then learned curriculum, right? So that's a really big one, and I remember that's kind of like the big duh moment, because you often say something and it is heard completely differently. So sometimes what we say has the opposite effect. So we take this example. Again, even with the best of intentions, what we say, what we do
can have the opposite effect of what we intend. I love this one.
Depends on the intonation.
And what comes next?
So now,
People to understand.
in a group of three, where you are sitting, in a group of three, I would like you to share something from your ministry where you had that clash between intent and impact. And it doesn't have to be about race. I want you to just talk about a time when you were in your formation ministry and you had a clash between intent and impact. What you intended was not at all what got heard or discussed. Okay, so just take a couple minutes, groups of three. No more than three. If you don't have
I have a role in that committee, and when I came into it, I had an understanding of that role. But it wasn't, I mean, even then it wasn't a very clear understanding, but very quickly I told myself a story and I knew what it was. And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna go and cash roll and we're gonna do all this work and then, and we're gonna push through the meeting and we're gonna get everything done. And I had initially met with like the chair of the committee right before I started. And then about 4 months later, we met again for the first time and we hadn't had a chance to like review it. And she was like, hey, I just wanna check in, it'll be great. And then we checked in and then it was this list of just like how not right I was doing committee. And just how, and not in a bad way, but just like my desire to meet certain pastoral needs I thought I needed to meet, as well as to accomplish goals and get through the meeting. Just, it made some people feel like, the language I used was hijacking their business and their ministry. Yeah, so that was like, and it led to really good reconciliation and work that's ongoing, but it was just, in the fact that it had gone on so long, and we hadn't had the chance to check in, which,
right.
so yeah.
So when you use that word hijacking, I have a physiological response, right? Because I've been in meetings where I've been accused of hijacking, and I've been in meetings where I've watched other people hijack.
Yeah.
And like, did any of you have like,
Yeah.
either of these stories, or you had that response?
Yeah.
So how many of you have done something where you intended something and it was received in a completely different and kind of disastrous way? Okay. And were you able to recover from that? Did you learn something from that experience?
Yeah.
Okay. So we know that we can do that. And yeah, when it comes to talking about something like racism, where we know that we're going to make mistakes and there's going to be a lot of emotion and a lot of rage and grief, we don't leave any room for those kinds of moments of growth where we're going to be able to learn from having our teeth kicked in maybe a little bit, from being accused of this, that, or the other thing. In my work with people who do the work of racial reconciliation or who are trying to get started on the work of reconciliation, there's a couple of things that really shut down the conversation right away, and I'm going to share those with you. So we know, and I think of like, there's all these matriarchs in my parish, and they come up to me and they say this all the time, right? Like they don't quite understand what my job is because they know me and they love me and I love them, right? So there's not a problem. So the historical experience of racism for me is not something that they would anticipate because I seem pretty happy when I'm singing in the choir. And I know that it comes out of their love for me and their good intentions, but so for those wonderful matriarchs in my church, and I think about them all the time, right? And I have one of them who I really love. She's in her 80s. And she said to me, but I don't see your color. I just want to learn about your culture. And I said, you can't have it both ways, right? If you're acknowledging that my culture is somehow different from yours, then you are in fact seeing my color. And to kind of get this place with her where she could acknowledge that just because we're different doesn't mean that you think less of me or I think less of you was really challenging for her. And again, she's in her 80s, a different generation. She's from a very, very affluent family. I don't think she knew any people of color growing up, right? Very sheltered kind of background. And bless her heart, she's trying. Bless her heart. So, but this is the other one. And in my diocese, this is really coming from recently ordained young white heterosexual priests. And it's very powerful. They're brilliant young women, and they have a really strong commitment to the work of anti-racism, right? So they are really trying to understand, as Dr. Brown was saying, they're trying to get people to understand the power of unearned privilege, right? They're trying to show people their own good intentions, and they're trying to say, we need to expand this, we need to make this more complicated. We need to understand racism as more than just interpersonal interaction. You ever heard people say, well, it's only natural that? I hate that. So my background is in sociology. And this notion of it's only natural that we would do something or feel something speaks to inevitability, suggests that we cannot change, right? That somehow it's hardwired into our DNA. So even listening to Dr. Brown talking about the neuroscience of we're hardwired, as a sociologist, I'm like, I'm not sure I can go there. And there's a lot that we don't know about the brain, and I would trust her expertise more than my own. But I have real difficulty with that because for me, this notion that we are hardwired to react in a particular way means that we cannot change. And if we look at the evolution of the Episcopal Church in terms of how we think about race, how we think about gender, how we think about sexual orientation and gender identity, we've moved really, really far, really, really fast. But again, for a lot of folks of color in the Episcopal Church, we're kind of standing around saying, wow, the church has really changed in a lot of places in terms of how we feel about LGBT clergy and how we feel about same-sex blessings, and we still can't talk about race. And this has been going on since the beginning, and we've made all this progress in this other area, and we're still lagging behind in this other area, right? So, again, it's a real difficult piece of trying to get beyond that. Now, when you talk to people about these things, the people who would say these things, there's a lot of self-righteousness on both sides, right? Both the I don't see color people and the, only white people can be racist. I'm kind of like, you should have heard some of the things that my dad said about people, right? And for him, as a Korean immigrant to the United States, the primary racial antipathy of his lifetime experience was with Japanese people, right? Having grown up under Japanese colonization in South Korea, right? So racism is not peculiar to the United States and between whites and blacks. Have you all seen, you know how Dr. Henry Louis Gates does that show on Ancestry? Genealogy? And I saw the thing where he had Don Cheadle. I don't know if any of you saw that. Where he traced back after Don Cheadle's family, and basically after the Emancipation Proclamation, Don Cheadle's ancestors were still enslaved. And they were enslaved by a group of Native Americans. And it's a history, and people of color, like, we're kind of reluctant to even talk about that, right? Because that doesn't make it it's not as easy. And Don Cheadle's response, I think you can find it on YouTube, and I'm sure I'm going to get it kind of wrong, but his basic response was like, well, it's not surprising to me that a people that experienced genocide at the hand of European explorers would learn something about those systems of power and exploitation. I'm sure that's not exactly what he said, but that was sort of the message of what he said.
And I thought, that's really great, because that's the kind of complex understanding that we need to have. And so we have to get beyond our own self-righteousness. And I mean, if we're going to look at what Brene Brown was telling us, I think that self-righteousness comes from shame. And I think a lot of times also our inability to kind of engage in these conversations in a meaningful way, particularly in predominantly white congregations, has to do with that sense of shame and a sense of fear, right? A sense of being unloved, a sense of probably, I mean, if you really sort of think about it, everyone can probably go back and find that moment that they're really ashamed of, where they engaged in something that was kind of racist, or where they stood by and watched, you know, somebody being bullied or harassed or whatever. And I mean, when I was in Maine, living in rural Maine, I was amazed because I would see people kicking a dog, and everyone would jump out of their car and start yelling and say, "Stop kicking that dog." I saw a gentleman haul back and punch his wife in the face, and everybody ran in the other direction. And I remember calling the police because the guy was much bigger than me, but people would save that dog, but they would not save that woman. So there's something about our culture that what is our own sort of fear, what is our own shame, right? What is our own kind of, what are our own, how's our identity getting in the way of our behavior? So I'm no theologian. I mean, I use the same like 3 excerpts from scripture because they're all in one I know. But this is my uncle, who is a Presbyterian minister, selected this for my wedding. And I love this. I thought, you know, it's a great one for thinking about how you want to be in a partnership with another person, how you might want to be a parent, how you might want to be a child, how you might want to be a friend, how you might want to walk with and labor with.
Is there any way that we could read that and see a difference between intent and impact?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm just curious, I mean, because it seems so uplifting, but on another level, I'm thinking if you, depending on the context, you're reading that to a group, they're going, oh, you think I'm not ambitious?
Yeah.
Or you think I'm conceited?
It's a great one when men say this to women, right?
Yeah.
Right? When straight people say this to LGBT people, right? When able-bodied people say this to people with physical challenges, when people with power say this to people with some powerlessness.
Good.
So I'm coming at this one with the sense that as people who have the resources to attend the conference and who are engaged in the ministry of spiritual formation, which is, again, I think in and of itself a privilege, is to think about this as a privilege, right? And I think that the basic work of racial reconciliation has to involve this idea that being in right relationship has to be more important than being right. And where the conversations break down, when I see conversations break down, it's because people are saying, no, you're not hearing me. This is my truth. And you have to accept it. And a person on the other side is, no, you are not hearing me. This is my truth. And again, the shame, the rage, the grief complicates all of it. And we haven't taken the time to really build a theological language around how we want to talk about race and racism. I mean, many people have done it. Martin Luther King has done great work. Howard Thurman has done great work. The Diocese of Atlanta is going to have a Howard Thurman event in April for their beloved community commission to dismantle racism. So, that theological brainy work is out there, right? We haven't adopted. We take the easy stuff. We take, I have a dream. We don't take the letter from the Birmingham jail, right? We've sort of sanitized those theologians who really challenged us to think about justice and equity in a much more challenging way. And we've made it palatable and we've made it easy, right? So we haven't embraced that theological framework. And this, for me, I mean, I'm kind of a nerdy person, but my mom is the theologian. My husband's Roman Catholic, so he can, he was raised Roman Catholic. He goes to church with us now, but It's a long story. Anyway, he's a recovering Catholic, but he would, in his lectures about to his college students, use quotations from Scripture, and they had no idea what he was talking about. I'm not the theologian, like I said, I know like 3 Bible verses. But this for me is an important piece, right? So I really like this because I think it asks us as people of privilege to think about what would it mean to be humble? What would it mean for us to just listen? Right? What would it mean for us to say that being in right relationship is more important than being right? So with my 80-year-old friend who was saying to me, I don't want to argue with you. I just want to love you and I just want to know your culture. Right? It was really hard for me to kind of take that moment of adrenaline and just sort of go, just manage my reaction, right? And as Episcopalians, how much do we love adrenaline? Like, it just isn't done, right? I mean, it really isn't. Passion, fire, anger, that's not really who we are, right? And so when it happens, we're a little bit, and it's in like, I think with like youth and young adults, right? I think probably maybe with like this corner over here, like the children, right? The sort of emotional kind of, but part of what we're doing in formation is teaching you how to manage all of that, right? So, but we have to allow ourselves to have those reactions. We have to allow the adrenaline surge and then still figure out how to be in right relationship. And sometimes the adrenaline surge is, oh my gosh, that person thinks I'm a racist. And I'm a person of color, but believe me, I've had a lot of people say, well, you're a racist, right? And in fact, I've had some angry letters from people in the Episcopal Church who said, well, if you are the one who insists that you see color and that you see race, then you're the racist. Like, so there. I was kind of like, yeah. And that was about the maturity and the level of engagement that I had. So we have that in our church. And we have really well-meaning people who want to engage and don't know how, right? So again, I do think that the intent and the impact, right? For people with power to say this to people without power, right? To say to, the homeless person, well, we really don't want you to sit in the front row because, this, it's just a little uncomfortable for the other people in the church, right? That's not what I'm talking about, but for those of us with privilege and power to be able to foster a conversation, being in right relationship should be more important than being right. All right. So, if you want to have a discussion about race and racism, if you give me your email, I can email you this little table. Here's some of how I would, when I've planned events with youth and young adults and college students, high school students, and it's probably hard to read, I make this kind of a table. Now, these categories may not really apply to you, but the biggest piece that people do not know when they say, we're going to have a conversation about racism in our parish, they don't do this one.
Can you read it out?
It says why.
It's hard to
This one
read.
says why. That's your task. Why do we want to have a conversation about race and racism? And a lot of times, the answer is because we're supposed to. Because it's politically correct. And when you dig deeper, it's because, in a lot of predominantly white parishes anyway, it's because I, as a white person, need to affirm my identity as a non-racist. And am I willing to be confronted with that information, right? And a lot of times the answer is, well, no, actually. Or you'll hear about a very wealthy parish, for example, that wants to partner with the immigrant parish, right? But they're not engaged in partnership. They want to do a little charity, and they want to feel really good about themselves, and then they want to walk away, right? You've seen that? And it might be homeless ministries or, sort of a food pantry or whatever it might be. It's not a real partnership, right? And part of that is, let's talk about the why. What does it mean for us as Christians to engage in this conversation, right? A deep and meaningful conversation. And if you do that and you talk about, okay, what could maybe go wrong, right? Just lay it out. But what are you really, really hoping for? And what are the things that you need to take into account? Now, if you're in Hawaii, that conversation is going to look really different than it will be if you're in Seattle versus being in Houston, right? Geographically, culturally, we all have different contexts within which we might want to try to have a conversation. So what I love is all these wonderful, well-meaning people in my parish in Seattle, they're saying well,
I mean, we need to talk about how the police are reacting in African American communities. And I said, the police just shot like 3 Native American youth, right? And you're not even looking at that because you have a very, because you think that we should Fergusonize ourselves, right? And that may not be our issue, right? Or another issue is we have all these undocumented dreamers. They're not just Latina or Latino. They're from Asia, they're from Eastern Europe, they're from Africa, they're from lots of different places. And when we think about sort of those dreamers and those kids wanting to go to college and we're only putting those materials in Spanish, we're not meeting the needs of our community, right? So, okay. Goals and objectives. Now this is basic learning, whether it's adult learning or childhood learning 101. What are your goals and objectives for learning? What do you hope people will be able to do when they come out the other side of whatever formation you're doing with them? And how would you measure it? Right? Now in anti-racism training, some of it is really good because it has a really solid theological framework. It has clearly identified goals and objectives. And it has a really solid way of measuring the delta, right? The change from the beginning to the end. And I will say, having had to experience a lot of it myself, that quite a lot of it doesn't have that, right? That really what it is the shame and blame game. And that will turn people off faster than anything, right? And part of it is they haven't done the why, they haven't done the goals and objectives. When we talk about race and racism, we know that we're going to deal with some conflict, right? Now we had a parish sort of storytelling listening session at my parish. I wasn't there, but I heard that it kind of devolved into nostalgia, right? So conversations about race and racism. So again, it was older, affluent white folks. My husband was like fit to be tied. He said there was a woman there who said, well, I grew up in Pasadena. And in Pasadena, California, we just didn't have any problems with race. And I'm thinking, Pasadena is where all the rich white folks moved to when South Central started getting integrated, right? So she just had this memory, like, well, we did it right back then. And like, all you young people now, bless your hearts, you don't know how to do it the way we did it. And there was a younger white woman there who basically said, reacted with some anger and some, how could you possibly say that? And she was so upset that she couldn't even get the words out. And then I heard about it after the fact. I was out of town. I was doing things. So, again, in your groups of 3, I want you to take a shot at this table, right? Pick whatever piece of it that you want to pick. But the first piece that you have to do is the why, right? Was when we do things about, let's have a conversation about race and racism. Okay, well, what that's going to look like? Well, I think we should have storytelling and we should limit people to 5 minutes, right? And we'll plant a couple of people that we're going to have tell their stories first, right? And we'll invite the 3 people of color in our parish and see if they want to talk. Well, we won't make them talk because we don't want them to feel exploited, but we'll invite them to talk if they want to talk because we need to have the other, right? It's all about the what and the how and the who. We haven't decided on the why, right? So spend a little time in your group of 3 and let's talk about the why. And talk about some of those fears, anxieties, hopes, dreams, details, and considerations. And then from there, again, as formation people, you have dealt with conflict. You have made mistakes. You've had to apologize. When you talk about racism, you're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. I piss people off all the time, right? If I did not have a strong stomach and a thick enough skin to understand all the times that I'm going to be misunderstood, very likely by some of you in this room, I wouldn't be able to engage, right? And again, so the emotional baggage that we bring with us when we want to talk about race and racism, we really have to unpack it. We have to acknowledge it. We have to understand that it's there first and do some of that work. All right. Start with the why. I don't know what's our timing like.
About 20 minutes.
Okay, so let's take a couple of minutes